All right, very excited about this as we're gonna kind of shift as we get into off-season mode. I like to pull back and do a little bit of a dive into some different corners of the NFL world, of the Bengals world, and take some time to think. The time that we don't spend thinking because we're too busy yelling at the play that happened, the bad call, or the contract negotiation. Let's talk a little bit about stats. And when we're doing that, there's someplace I love to go, and that is to go to Sumer Sports. And that's why I've brought in Lindsay Rhodes, who hosts the Sumer Sports show. Hope you guys are listening to Lindsay. How we doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Thank you. Yeah, in many ways, it's funny. Like you talk about, you get on the hamster wheel of the season. In many ways, this time of year, or like just the off season in general, for many reasons, is I like it just as much as the season, which might make me a nerd. But I really like the ability and the time to kind of dive into some of these numbers and figure out what's going on, like the peek behind the curtain, and then obviously all of the roster building components of the off season. I find fascinating. So these are conversations that are right up my alley. So I'm happy to be here.
I appreciate it, and nobody does it better than you guys do, honestly. I know we've had Eric Eager on
He's
last
the
year and
best.
in the past, he's doing a great job in Carolina. Now he's a TV star. Now he's on there. Saw him on their behind the scenes show,
Yes.
over the draft, and I was like, oh, look at
Sitting
it.
in the
That's how it
row
goes.
behind,
Yeah,
yeah, making it all happen. He's a
good spot. The chair hierarchy very important there to where you end up. You know. But it's you guys are such a great job. You do a show with Sam that is it's been called the Sticky Stats series,
Mhm.
and it's about predictability. It's really about who's going to continue to be good and who can where you find the underlying stats that really matter that tell you maybe who could be better be and maybe some of the box score stats that we
Yeah.
spend so much time counting. We should be looking beyond that. Can you take me into the thought behind putting this series together and kind of some of the background of what you guys do at Sumer and the information that you guys have access to?
Well, the thought process behind the series was that I think thematically that we're at an inflection point in the NFL, probably sports in general, but specifically in the NFL of like there's a tilt that's happening in terms of which stats matter. And for so long, people have cited very specific box score stats that people feel comfortable with. And then in the last 5 years or so, I'd say there's just been an explosion of advanced stats and data people that are doing hard work behind the scenes trying to come up with ways that we can better measure the ways that different players are contributing to plays, to the outcomes, and or the way we can allocate blame a little bit more effectively. Like some really obvious examples, or like, I think we all kind of know, like, interceptions. A quarterback will throw an interception or will throw the ball. It'll get tipped off the wide receiver's hands, land in the defender's hands, and it's an interception, but it's not the quarterback's fault. And we all can think of different examples like that. And so you could say, okay, we have to come up with a better way to track this, right? Well, that's true all over the field. I mean, there's so many stats that just don't tell the story of what's actually happening. And so I have in the last year gone on different shows where I live in this very specific world where almost everybody I'm talking to speaks the same advanced stats language, and we're kind of having the same conversations about which stats we're citing stats, let's say, to tell a story about a different player. And then I'll get a comment on Twitter or something that goes, I don't even know what that means. And I'm like, oh, that's right. I need to be more clear about that because not everybody is having this specific siloed conversation. And then I'll go on a podcast and, let's say Aaron Rodgers was a perfect example where this came up a lot this year, where people would go, well, but Lindsay, he threw for the eighth most passing yards this year. And I was like, oh my God, that's right. Some people are still looking at that and think that
Mhm.
that means that he's the eighth best quarterback in the NFL. And so start at the very beginning. How many attempts did he have? The second most in the NFL. How many yards per attempt did he rack up? Oh, it was like the 31st ranked yards per attempt. So now we're starting to kind of peel back like a story here. We just have better ways to tell the story of what's happening on the football field now. And so to know that there are people that are still just like looking at the traditional box score stats, I literally pulled up ESPN yesterday because we did our last episode of the Sticky Stat series, which was about defense. And I pulled up ESPN looking for a specific stat. And this is the perfect example. These are the stats that you can get on ESPN's website. I'm like knocking ESPN. That's not my intent, but this is the point, right? You can find out how many tackles a player had, how many sacks they had, tackles for loss, interceptions, forced fumbles. Like there's literally no efficiency stats. There's no rates. So like pressure rate, sack rate, how many snaps were they on the field for all of this? Because if you filter just for sacks, I mean, sacks might be a bad example, but like interceptions is a great example. If you filter for interceptions and you're like, the one with the most interceptions is the best cornerback, that is untrue because we know inherently that what we want out of our cornerback is to take the wide receiver out of the play. So, perfect world, if I'm judging, like, if I'm looking at a defense, how do I know my cornerback's doing great? It's the quarterback is dropping back, surveying the defense and going, can't throw there. So you could make an argument that the best cornerback in the NFL is the one who plays the most snaps with the fewest targets, right? Like, and that's an upside down stat. So like for cornerbacks, upward counting stats, I think are really misleading because it means they're getting thrown at a lot because they have an opportunity to make plays. So anyway, all stats need context. And so there is no stat that exists right now that is a perfect fit, tells the entire story. But I think that's why I love talking about them so much and why I've really enjoyed the series is because we get a chance to tell some of those stories and figure out the context and also maybe identify which stats are stickiest, which in the context of our series means a number of different things. It could mean this one has it's consistent year over year. Might not actually tell you a player is good, like a wide receiver average depth of target. That is likely to be consistent for that wide receiver year over year for obvious reasons. It just tells you what kind of wide receiver they are. Like where are they typically operating in what area of the field? Are they a guy who stretches the field? They have a higher ADOT. That's likely to be consistent for his career. So that's a sticky stat. It's not a stat that tells us that he's good or not, right? So there are a bunch of different ways that we could define this.
I can tell you one person that thinks there should be a little bit more depth in the stats, and that's Joe Burrow, who gets so mad anytime an interception happens because of a tipped ball or something like. He's like, and he would be like, there was one year where I think everybody was questioning on how many interceptions he had, and he's like, we're not counting the ones that are tipped. Right, because I'm not taking responsibility for that stuff. Like but every interception has a story. Like if you ask Zach Taylor and Joe Burrow and Dan Pitcher to sit down and talk about every interception, you'd have an hour-long conversation about how and why it happened. And Joe wanted to make sure for a long time, these are not all my fault, okay? Like I can't be having on the hooks, but the offensive lineman would have the same conversation saying, these sacks are not all our fault. And the context so important, which is why I wanted to get into this. You guys did, you have a lot of different, I'm not going to get into quarterback here. We all know Joe Burrow is good. We don't need stats on that. We have eyeballs. But we do have a lot of questions about the Bengals offensive line. And in terms of a conversation I have a lot with Bengals coaches is how much they want to make it easier on the Bengals offensive line. Joe Burrow does cause a lot of extra sacks by the way that he plays. The scheme does cause a lot of extra sacks and hits by the way that they are so pass heavy and how many times they just go and all eligible out and leave one-on-ones everywhere. What is a stat that you guys have found the stickiness of for offensive line play to differentiate where the offensive lineman was good and where they maybe weren't?
Offensive line, individual assessment of offensive line, I think requires the most, it's one of the harder ones in the sense that there's obviously a lot that goes into that picture. And we know that offensive line is a weak link system in terms of whether something results in frankly, it could be a weak link system that impacts who you're even facing on the defensive line, right? Or, there's a lot of context needed. So what we've found is that the stats that actually aren't stats, but are typically derived by tracking data and have constraints of time periods, something, so you're defining it very specifically, like a time frame, 2.5 seconds. Within 2.5 seconds, we're going to judge everybody here. We've created a couple of metrics at Sumer that are based on tracking data. So what I love about the tracking data stuff is that it's player agnostic. So it literally doesn't know who it's grading. We've just fed the system with hundreds of thousands of past football plays, and then kind of trained it to like to know how to read those plays. And then so now it knows the probability on a frame by frame basis as each play is developing. It's rad. I'd love to show it to you sometime. So, but we can break it down into pass, block, get off, which is the pressure allowed probability at 1 second post get off versus the snap. So, and then we have pass, block, finish. So it's just measuring the pressure allowed probability at 2 seconds versus the snap. So how well is he holding up on this block, right? So I'm glad you asked about O-line, because I actually did a deep dive on the Bengals O-line and I found some really interesting stuff. That's not necessarily good, but it does come back around to what you asked about with regards to Burrow. So we also have a broader Sumer score, which is just pass blocking Sumer score in general. That's supposed to take like all of this into account. It is essentially all of the things that get off, the finish, and the results of the entire play kind of taken into account. So in that, 3 players on the offensive line last year in Cincinnati scored in the upper half of the league. So like kind of a lower bar there, upper half, in either pass blocking or run blocking Sumer score. That was Ted Karras, 79% pass block, Cordell Volson, 73% run block, Orlando Brown, 68% run block. After that, the highest anyone scored in either category was 37th, and that was Mims in pass blocking. Alex Kappa was highlighted as somebody who had a particularly poor season. He was sub 10th percentile in pass blocking and run blocking, dead last in run blocking, 84th out of 84. So it looks to me like it was smart to replace both guards, which is something that they did this offseason.
Yes.
Dylan Fairchild, the guy that they drafted, 80th percentile in pass blocking in college and has some high scores in terms of get off and finish there. Found something interesting, though, for Orlando Brown when we filter for more specificity. His pass block get off is in the 85th percentile. So basically, Brown is not getting blown by. Everyone else was sub 55 percentile. Pass block finish was 99 percentile. So that means that he's basically also settling down well and not allowing a high probability that a player is going to make a move and beat him. So what I wondered then is, why is his total number lower than either of those two numbers? It was 68%. So I wanted to investigate what was going on around him. This is the context that's necessary for all of these stats. So I started with Burrow. Look into his sack avoidance. Okay, this is the sack outcome minus the probability of pressure after 2 seconds. He's in the 47th percentile. So what we know is that Brown did his job well, but a few of the other guys did not. O-line's a weak link system. So my guess is that other guys on the line are maybe letting Brown down, and Burrow is letting the play develop, even when it's maybe a bad idea, because he's so confident that Chase and Higgins can bail him out. Both of them are top 3rd in route running, top 25 after the catch, and top 12 overall. So I think that there's an interesting story there where you started off with regards to Burrow and all of these things kind of working together. Even in this case, 47th percentile sack avoidance, you could look at that and go, oh, he can't avoid the sack. I think it, because of what we know about the team, probably tells a different story. And that is that he knows he has to make these plays anyway, right?
Yeah.
Because of what we're seeing statistically in some of these offensive line scores for us. So he's going to continue to be under pressure, and he's got to find a way to work around that. And he clearly did so successfully. And so the sack avoidance doesn't concern me, because he's just buying time. And how many of those pressures did not turn into sacks because at the last second he was able to get the ball out and he hit these guys and they're able to pick up yards after the catch and make a big play.
I love the Burrow conversation, and we spent a lot of time parsing through that here because weirdly the whole pressure to sack thing with Burrow has become a weird conversation. I actually had a great conversation with Dan Pitcher about that. We played it on the podcast a week or two ago, and he was like, I live my professional life trying to figure out how to keep our offense explosive and get less hits on him. But it comes back to the way that we are all playing around him. It's the style of game they were forced to play last year, where he was constantly having to make a play, constantly having to come from behind, constantly in a shootout. And I asked Burrow about that specifically the next week, and he said, that's kind of the difference. It's understanding. He's like, I go into the game, the first drive, I play the same every week. And then I figure out what type of a game am I in? He knows when he goes to Baltimore on Thanksgiving this year, what it's going to be. He's going to have to put up numbers to keep up with Lamar. And so they're probably going to have games where he's, making plays and taking hits, and he's okay to do with that. But you can't always hold that against the offensive line. I'm so glad you brought up the Orlando Brown thing. He had an unbelievable year last year before his injury, and he came back and played on one leg at the end. But because of everything happening around him, people probably weren't giving Orlando enough credit for the level he was playing at left tackle, and the type that you can build around, and that is worth every penny. But he, kind of gets into a mush of, well, I don't know, there's a lot of sacks, everybody's bad there, and it's like when you single it out, you can really see the level that Orlando specifically was playing at last year. When he would get guys locked up, it was over.
The sack number is another one that drives me crazy just in general as being an offensive line stat because, and I know we've discussed a lot of the context here surrounding the sacks that are Burrow's fault, right? Like a lot of it is environmental and it creates a scenario. So not everything is just easily explained away, but sacks are not solely an offensive line stat. They are oftentimes a quarterback stat too, and also pressures. And the team that I think is the best example of this year, at least in some ways, is the Bears. So the Bears allowed 68 sacks this year, and so people talk about that as if the Bears O-line allowed 68 sacks this year, and therefore the Bears O-line is the worst O-line in the league. But we kind of know from watching them play that some of that was on Caleb. So what I'm actually kind of in the process of trying to put together a list, this is my new obsession coming off of our O-line podcast, is trying to figure out a way to calculate how many sacks for each team is actually the fault of the O-line, and then creating a separate metric where we can rank that against itself. So how many sacks did each O-line specifically give up? Because those are all attributed to individuals if they gave them up. So the Bears, for instance, I counted 37 sacks that were actually attributed to an offensive lineman. 37 of 68, that's only 54% of their sacks. So almost half of their sacks were the fault of someone else, whether that's a running back not picking up a block or maybe a tight end, or probably a large number of them are the fault of Caleb in this case. And so I started kind of just doing that for each team. And I am still in the process of doing it, so I don't have any finished numbers. But like the Bengals, for instance, 48 total sacks, 35 were the fault of the offensive line, at least. And, somebody decided that each individual should get credit for these. So that's 73% of the sacks. So in this case, we're talking about pressure to sack and Joe Burrow, but that's 73% of the sacks as opposed to 54 for the Bears that were the actual fault of the O-line. So it's and it's just barely a lower number than the Bears, right? Which, by the way, is actually a high number. Once I started doing this, I was like, well, the Bears O-line, maybe it's not bad,
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh no, it still is. Like it's still up there.
Bad.
37 is still pretty high. But I do think it's interesting to look at it as like the percentage of total sacks that actually are the offensive line, because it's wildly different from team to team. Like the Texans are around 73% also. So the Texans also gave up a ton of sacks last year. And so, maybe that's a valid conversation. We really need to have a conversation about changing their offensive line, and how that impacted CJ Stroud in his second season, right?
Yeah.
So, but I'm glad you brought up the sacks in general, because that is another one of those, same like the interception with the quarterback, right? Like not all sacks are offensive line stats, and so we need to stop just throwing out the team's sack number and or total pressures and blaming that all on the offensive line. It's not an offensive line story all the time.
On the flip side of that, and to me, this is the most fascinating part of sticky stats for me. And what I enjoyed the most was the defensive line conversation, because it's so prevalent here, in terms of Trey Hendrickson, who's at the top of so many of all the metrics that you want to be. And he's sticky. He's been sticky, despite the fact that, there's a lot of talked about his sacks and how much that actually means when you have a guy that can't play the run as well, and all that's a separate conversation. But he's a part of it. Where I wanted to go in, though, was finding the underlying numbers with young players. So they have Miles Murphy here, who didn't have any sacks, but they cite a lot of maybe some of the pressure rate in a smaller sample size, and what's the value of that. And then they drafted Shamar Stewart, who didn't have sacks in college, but he points out he led his team in pressures, and the importance of pressure rate, which you guys really dove into in the defensive line episode. How did you guys parse through that when you started talking about predicting the underlying numbers, especially when looking at young players and maybe who would end up being better than maybe some of the basic or the old box score stats suggest?
I think if you zoom out, I think some of it's logical. To me, pressure versus sack, it makes sense that it's more sticky, or at which it is. Pressure rate, by the way, not pressure totals. And it makes sense too to judge. I think the pressure rate, i.e., the number of snaps where you're actually seeing pressure, and then how much pressure or I'm off defense line. I'm kind of jumping back and forth in terms of how I talk about this. The number of times that you are rushing the passer as a defender, and then how many times you successfully log a pressure. That percentage, it tells you a story about process. So many alter the actual outcome. That could be the quarterback that you face, and whether or not he throws away, understanding when to. That doesn't mean that you have any less well, because it didn't up in a sack. You forced an outcome. It's not an outcome that was a specific number that now we're going to track and award defensive player of the year numbers for, like, because you have a high number of sacks. Like, so to me, you want to look at the process as opposed to the result. And in Trey Hendrickson's case, and in the case of other players on the show, the process is a pressure rate. And that one is more likely to be consistent year to year. You're going to have sack numbers that fluctuate. For some of the best players in the league, they're going to always, be relatively high compared to their peers. But just think of the stories that you could tell about that. Like, we could, there are examples of defensive linemen who are on lines where they don't have another guy who's that great. Like, that's one of the things that I think we know that the Bengals benefit from. Wide receivers, your number one wide receiver is only as good as wide receiver. And that makes sense point, because now you have to account for the second receiver defensively. Throw all of your defensive attention or game plan. It can't just be for the number one guy, so it's going to free him up. Same thing for pass rushers. Max Crosby is an example that I think for years we were like, get one so that they can't just time, and then his sack number is lower than it would be, and he's freeing up other people. He's taking blockers, but like, do they have the talent to take advantage of that? And then what do his individual numbers look like? The individual numbers are all kind of they're relative. They're environmentally influenced. I think you want to look at it through the lens of as much as you possibly can, like the upward counting stats.
Yeah. This is it's a fascinating conversation. Was there any I know you did a look into a bunch of Bengal stats as part of this. Does anything stick out when you kind of just took a general broader view at some of the stuff you guys have on Bengals that made sense to you or that opened your eyes a little bit?
Let's see. Most of the wrote down that I thought was really interesting was offensive line related. So we went
Yeah.
through that already. Um, the also I want to point out too, related to the offensive line, is how much that impacts the run game, right?
Yeah.
So even that's one of the things that we really pulled out from our running back episode is how much running back stats are hard, man, because there really aren't any that are that sticky, and even the stickiest stats have so so it's really hard to predict a running back is good because they're good, or a running back is good because offensive line. Just even zooming out, and the biggest story this past year was Saquon Barkley and Derek and the running back resurgence. And not to be a Debbie Downer, I think that it tells a totally different story. I think it tells the story that we've been saying for a long time, which is that good runners are worth paying high rate um, when they are on offense. Like that's when you're them do what they can do. And
Mhm.
Saquon's a perfect example of that. Last year, his numbers were all of these charts in every advanced metrics. They don't look anything like they did this past season when he was on the Eagles, running behind that Eagles offensive line and playing with those wide receivers that are freeing up space. And so um, running back is really, really tough because it's hard to look at any individual numbers and because they're good or they're bad.
Yeah.
They're on a bad like Josh Jacobs his last year in Las Vegas. I literally was like, I don't know if he's good anymore, and it doesn't make any sense that at his
Mhm.
age fallen off a but there's no evidence that he's good. There's none. And then he goes to a different team and he looks good. So I think that with regards to the run game, which, the Bengals weren't necessarily the 30th in rushing yards per game. A lot of that is heavily tied to the number of rushes and the fact that they were upside down in terms of script more frequently than we've seen the Bengals in recent years. Um, with us, the second low. But pretty much all of the stats like near toward the bottom in terms of rushing yards over expected per attempt is 19th, number of explosive runs is 28th, success rate 20. um but I wonder too, based on all of the O-line stats that I broke down, how much that's just the story of the O-line.
Right.
And so one of the things that we do know is that a lot of these advanced stats, when you look at them individually for running back, is what they're actually good for. You can look at running backs that are in the same environment and judge them against each other. So, for instance, if we were to pull up Chase Brown and Moss, right? So that unless there are specific examples, you could say, oh, the O line, we lost that guy, and this guy didn't have that guy blocking for him. But in general, if you're playing in the same environment and you're having different levels of success, then you can kind of gauge this guy's better than that guy. If we were to take Chase Brown and put him in a different team, then we don't know if his numbers would look anything like this because it's specific environment.
Yeah.
There was a stat a couple of years ago that really got my brain going in that direction. That was Don Jackson for the Colts. I don't know if you even remember him, but he started the season, I want to say it was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago for the Colts at running back. His yards before contact was very low. And so at that, I was like, oh, maybe they're terrible. Like this is, oh, I didn't see that coming. It's the Colts. We've long thought that they had a great offensive line. What's happening here? And then they switched and they went to Zach Moss, right? Like
Mhm.
coincidentally, and that specific number yards before contact went way up. And so I was like, oh, that in this case is not an offensive stat. That is telling us that Deion Jackson doesn't have vision or something like that. He's not, that's a him stat. But you can
Mhm.
only know that that's a him stat when you have someone else in the same environment to compare it to. So moving forward, what I would say with all of the individual running back stats, they're not as good to compare each other unless you know that the environment's going to stay the same. So if you're looking for a running back in week 6, then sometimes those numbers are interesting because you know that that's the environment that they're playing in. So they will likely continue to produce in a similar fashion. But if you're looking for who's the next best running back, or is this running back not good anymore, then you might need to compare them against their own past performances to see if they've increased or declined, or against some on their team to
Yeah.
compare and contrast.
Yeah, Bengals end up a kind of a premium example of that last year, where once they went from Zach Moss to Chase Brown, boy, things took off for them in the running game and in the passing game to the running
Yep.
backs out of the backfield, and it set something off. And it wasn't that Zach Moss was necessarily bad, but it was that you just saw something click just right when he got in there in a different way, to because it's meshing with the line and with the offense and so many other things, and building that chemistry with the quarterback and the passing game. There's so many other factors that go into it. But when you have two right against each other, and I think it's why, always recommend the multi-back system. And you see so many teams go to it now because there's a hot hand each year. There's a way that one guy clicks with a certain offense one year that maybe another one won't. So the more that you have, that you're not locked into some bell cow system, the better chance that the way the chips fall for you that year, you can find something that will fit whatever that is. And so I think Chase Brown is going to be a main guy here this year, but you also have a lot of other intriguing options. And Taj Brooks, who they drafted in the 6th round, Samaje
Yeah.
Perine's here now. They've got guys that could, in case there's some clunkiness this next year, that you could get something that ends up feeling like you found the right path, and maybe that is somebody else. You never know.
That,
But I think they love Chase Brown.
that's actually a good note too, just in terms of, you brought up like if somebody's a goal line back or a short yardage back, worth pointing out their expected stats. So like expected points or rushing yards over, those are going to be lower because what they're expected to do is gain 2 yards, right? And so if they
Mm-hmm.
gain 2 yards, they might be crushing it at their job, but they're not, you know, like if you're a goal line back, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're up against the, literally can't do much more than is it. So unless you're getting left in the backfield at a high rate and you are losing expectation, you're doing worse than expected, you don't have much opportunity to exceed expectation. So that's another example of context being necessary. Unfortunately, like we all want an easy, quick fix stat that just tells the story entirely. Unfortunately, and I'm can't say that these exist as somebody who's selling stats. The context is necessary, but I also think that that's one of the funny things about the conversations that kind of exist in uh like in the NFL community, where it's like analytics and like nerds and I think it's so funny that almost everybody that I work is like banging the context table, and
Yeah.
like looking
Yeah.
for ways to better tell the context of the story because they know numbers are not wholly perfect. And so it's kind of like what people think of the numbers people as is actually in many ways the opposite of what we are.
And that's why the analytics departments in these teams are so important, because they know the context, are able to provide them, and then
Yes.
find those wins on the margins that you try to get, and you dedicate your life to, really, if you're in those positions, to finding those, because you know the context,
Yep.
how to filter out what matters here for your particular team. So
Yep.
another bang of the drum for adding to analytics departments, and maybe that means the Bengals will have maybe a third person. Maybe they'll admit that they just got to 2, so let's not rush anything just yet. But maybe a third person.
Or, you could just contract us here at
Hey,
Zoomer. We'll
that's
do it
it.
for you.
Absolutely, as they should. If you want context, if you want great conversation about how to be a smarter NFL fan, I cannot recommend Sumer and the show that you guys do over there enough. And the Sticky Stat series is fascinating. And I think if you want to be a smarter NFL viewer and really understand teams, and there's a lot of Bengals context in there. As I went through it, I was like, you can kind of go through, and I was ticking story ideas off of my head as you guys were going through stuff.
Yay.
I was like, this is really, really interesting stuff. And it will be showing up in some of my future stories. That much I
I
can
love
guarantee. I've
hearing that.
already got a few nuggets there. So it's going to be great. But make sure you give that a listen. It's in the show notes. So just go ahead and click there and get the subscribe button and all that stuff. They do great work over there. Lindsay, certainly appreciate your time so much. Thanks for joining us. And we will catch up down the road.
I'd love to do that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Lindsay.